Hey guys, welcome back to Life by the Bow. Obviously something a little different today, and something that I used to do when I first started this channel. When we had really windy weeks where the weather wasn't necessarily working out, I used to sit down here in front of the camera and do some type of podcast style informational video just to continue to keep the content flowing. And I want to get back to doing that, especially with podcasts becoming so popular, just because I really do think that I do have a lot of valuable information to give that doesn't necessarily always make it into the video. So I'm basically just going to be speaking my mind, talking about what it takes, some of the precautions, things that you guys can keep in mind. If you are inspired by some of our content and you want to take a smaller boat on some type of long range crossing, whether it's the Bahamas, the dry Tortugas, or simply just going offshore fishing. So that's what we're going to be focusing on today's video. So you can sit down here, watch it, maybe listen to it in a car ride, maybe at the gym, who knows. But basically, I'm just going to go step by step based on what we do and the precautions that we take based on taking a smaller size vessel on a long range trip offshore. So it's kind of funny, I get a lot of people saying things in the comments that mention taking a small vessel across big open water. Really isn't that big of a deal. We see people do it with jet skis, skiffs, bay boats. It's becoming more popular and it's becoming more prevalent just because I think that the engines on these watercrafts and boats are becoming a lot more reliable. But at the same exact time, the ocean is still just as unforgiving as it's always been. So we got to make sure that, we're planning this out correctly. Of course, it may be cake on a glass calm day, but conditions change and things happen on the boats. Things do go wrong. So first things first, is the boat capable? Of course, most boats are capable, but there's a lot of things to consider, the structural components of the boat, electrical aspects. But once we, kind of have trust in our boat and its structural integrity, wiring, whatever it may be, you can get to actually planning your trip. And the first thing that I always like to do is find a buddy boat. Of course, us filming content, we don't always have access to that. So sometimes we just have to go. But if you can bring a buddy boat, that's something that I always suggest, especially if you are in a smaller boat. I mean, this is almost key because if you need to jump ship, you need a ship to jump to. I always suggest crossing with someone that has a bigger boat, maybe multiple engines. And say, for example, a couple buddies, you guys all have bay boats, no one really has access to a larger boat. I suggest going a couple boats deep so that way, if things start happening in twos or God forbid even threes, there's a lot of ships to jump to. This is why you always typically see personal watercrafts going across in big numbers because those things are very unreliable and things do happen. So once you have a buddy boat, first thing second, you want to start planning around your weather. And this is definitely something that you don't want to mess around with. I understand that these trips get very exciting. It's something that maybe you've wanted to do your entire life or for a couple years, couple months, couple weeks. And as that anticipation builds up, you get to the point where you're like, I'm going no matter what. But one thing I can say is you really, really want to respect the ocean. You want to respect the weather because it's just not fun getting over there and it's raining or it's windy. You're better off just waiting and spending your money and taking that trip when the conditions are proper and they're best, in my opinion. And one thing that I suggest too is start checking the weather about a week prior to the trip and check it consistently all the way up until, say 12 hours before you go to sleep. You don't want to check the weather 2 days prior and then come the day of and then the forecast completely change and you're in some really bad conditions. So constantly check the weather before you go. I take a lot of safety precautions. Obviously, once you get about 5 to 10 miles offshore, you lose cell phone service, and that's a big deal because if you get into trouble, there's no one to help you. So we suggest investing in things like satellite communication devices. We use the Garmin InReach Mini. We've also invested in a life raft, a VHF radio, and then of course all your standard safety equipment. The life raft is something that I really suggest. They're pricey, you know, they can be anywhere between $2,000 to $3,000, but it's worth it if something were to go wrong. So make sure you have all the safety equipment and go above and beyond with that, because you know, at the end of the day, it's not worth your life. Next, obviously, prepare your boat. Bring a lot, but at the same exact time, not too little. Understand once you get to places like the Bahamas, there's not always access to everything that you need. I like bringing spare props if I'm going over in a smaller boat with a single engine, fuel filters, all types of little miscellaneous things. If your boat does have a history of certain things that have been continuously going wrong, I suggest preparing with those parts and bringing those across if you can. But like I said, you know, you don't really want to weigh down the boat with a bunch of stuff that you're just not going to use, because especially in the smaller boats, once you start loading them down, the handling changes completely. So this is something that could actually get dangerous if you were to start experiencing some heavy seas. So just always remember that the more you bring, the more it's going to weigh down the boat. The more you weigh down the boat, it can sometimes dramatically affect the way that the boat handles. So of course, always bring a lot of fuel. That's something that you can never bring too much of, in my opinion. Early 2023, when we crossed our bay boat over to the dry Tortugas, we brought about 30 gallons of extra fuel. And we never ended up using that fuel, but at the same exact time, when you run out of fuel, you're dead in the water, and that's not something that you ever want to experience. It's a bad feeling. Of course, bring all your food, bring all your drinks, bring all of your belongings. It's always best to just make a checklist and knock things off the checklist as you go, rather than trying to think of everything and store it in your head, because it just gets so jumbled between the excitement and the anticipation, and really just bringing all the things that you need in order to do one of these trips. And I typically start a couple days prior. You know, for example, if we're gonna leave on a Friday, I start on a Monday, and I very slowly start preparing things, because it's best to space things out, keep a clear head, so that way you make sure that you're not forgetting anything. And I can promise you it does happen. When you think you're prepared, typically there's something that we always forget no matter what. So once you kind of have everything together and you know what you need, then it's time to start loading your boat. And this can make or break a crossing in certain occasions, so to speak, because, especially with a smaller boat, depending on how you load it has a lot to do with how that boat is going to handle that crossing. So say, for example, you have a following sea where the waves are essentially behind you and you're surfing over the top of them. It's best to load your weight towards the back of the boat in order to keep the bow up to prevent the boat from nosediving. On the other hand, what I like doing is whenever I'm in a head sea, I like distributing a little bit more of my weight towards the front of the boat, so that way it keeps the bow down and it's essentially cutting through the waves much better, rather than if I were to have all the weight towards the rear. What happens is when you put a lot of that weight towards the rear, the boat becomes very light in the bow. And basically it doesn't allow the bow to cut through the waves and run flat and level through the water. And this is something that you should play around with every single time you use your boat and you go out on the water, because ultimately, when your manufacturer builds your boat, they basically distribute the weight when the boat is completely dry. There's nothing inside of it. Obviously it has fuel. Maybe they compensate for live wells in the back, but they don't compensate for what you're gonna be putting in the boat, and they're not compensating for sea conditions. So you can fine tune your boat based on loading things in the bow or loading things in the stern, maybe in the console, to basically fine tune how your boat is gonna handle those sea conditions. So that's something that's always important. Once you have the boat entirely loaded up, something to start thinking about is your hotel and your dock slip. Obviously, if you're going to a place like the dry Tortugas, keep in mind that there's no docks over there, and the only way to keep your boat there overnight is by anchoring it within the little anchoring area right there in Garden Key. So it is suggested to have some type of inflatable paddleboard, something that you can get to and from your boat. And say, for example, you're staying on the island, just remember, before you ever leave, once the boat's loaded up, make sure you have a hotel or you have your accommodations handled, and you also have a dock slip prepared and ready to go. The reason why I say this, I hate to say it, but I have went to the Bahamas with certain people before, and they had their hotel room booked, but they didn't have a dock slip. And this is a big no-no because, you know, a lot of these places in the Bahamas, they're more popular than ever. You're not just gonna show up and get a dock slip. So you wanna make sure that that's something that you prepare for. I hear it a lot, people don't sleep the night before because they're so excited to make, you know, this journey. It's something they've been waiting a long time to do. And one thing I can say is there's been a lot of times where we've woken up and we've been ready to go, and the weather just simply was not what the forecast had said it was gonna be the day prior. My rule of thumb, whenever I'm doing any type of long range crossing in a small boat, is I want 5 knots of wind or less. You know, with these bay boats or a skiff, I wouldn't really even suggest doing it in a skiff or a jet ski unless you had big numbers. 5 knots of wind. Flat bottom boats, you know, they're not meant for big heavy seas. They're meant for, you know, 1 to 2 feet of chop at most. And once you start getting above 5 knots of wind, you start getting that 2-foot chop, and it's not comfortable when you're doing it for 100 miles or even as far as 150 miles like I've done. So if you're over 5 knots and you just have to go, I would not go in anything over 10. That's just kind of my rule of thumb, 10 knots of wind. Another thing to consider is wave direction. For example, when we go from our house here in Tavernier over to Bimini, if the wind is blowing out of the north and we have 5 knots of wind, the waves are going to be exceptionally bigger if we were to have a south wind and 5 knots of wind. The reason why is because here's the Bahamas right here, and here is the state of Florida. Say this way is north, this way is south. The Gulf Stream current travels from the south up to the north, and basically if you have the Gulf Stream current going this way and you have a wind direction going this way, the two are conflicting and it's going to create much bigger wave heights. So if you have a north wind, always remember that the seas are going to be a lot rougher versus if you had something like an east wind or a south wind. But as long as you're at that 5 knot mark, you shouldn't have to worry regardless of whichever way that the wind direction is traveling. But that's just kind of my rule of thumb. Now, there's 2 things that I like to consider whenever I'm doing these crossings. Something that I suggest doing is getting to your nearest point and then making the crossing from there. And what I mean by that is if I were to go from here at home straight over to a place like Bimini, it's going to take me about 90 miles to get there. So that's 90 miles of open water. On the other hand, if I were to travel and trailer my boat from here all the way up to Miami and then go from Miami straight across, that's only 55 miles. So though you probably don't want to trailer your boat, sometimes that may be a better option just to cut down on the amount of time that you're going to spend in open water. So you guys know us, we have a great relationship with the Ameritrail boat trailers. I know that trailering can be a little intimidating for some people whenever you have to go a further distance. But say for example, maybe I wanted to do a trip over to the West End. If I were to do that in a bay boat or a smaller boat, I would trailer from the Keys all the way up to say an area like Fort Lauderdale or say West Palm Beach, where the crossing is much shorter rather than going straight across. Huge shout out to our sponsor, Ameritrail Boat Trailers. You know, they put a trailer underneath our boat throughout this entire season, and it has welded bunks. So basically it's set up to be a power on, power off trailer. So basically what I mean by that is it only takes a little bit of power just to get the boat off the trailer, and it takes a little bit of power to get it up, and it's gonna fit the boat on the trailer perfect every single time, because those welded bunks essentially fit the bottom of the boat like a glove. So it just makes things that much easier. You also have retractable straps on the back of the boat, all LED lighting, and basically these trailers are built with top quality components. They've been supporting us here on the channel all throughout 2023 and just want to show them some love. So just in case you do need something to get your boat that extra further distance, but once you get to your starting point, what I suggest doing is leaving as early as possible for multiple reasons. Number one, because especially in the summertime, the later that you wait in the day, the more potential you're leaving on the table in order for storms to develop. And ultimately, you do not want to make this crossing whenever there is storms, because obviously when storms develop, wind speeds increase, and when wind speeds increase, wave heights increase, and you also run the risk of being struck by lightning. And this is definitely a situation that you do not ever want to be caught in whenever you're in a small boat or a personal watercraft. Though you may have those perfect conditions, slicked out calm, 5 knots of wind, it can go from a 1 foot sea to a 3 to 5 foot sea very quickly. And if you're not experienced in these conditions, it's something that can get ugly very quickly. So remember that, always leave as early as possible for that reason. Another great thing about leaving early is you have the entire day to yourself once you get there, once you do your crossing. So that's what I like doing. I like spending the first couple hours of the day getting over there and then basically having a whole day to just enjoy myself over in the dry Tortugas, the Bahamas. We've been caught crossing over to the dry Tortugas in the dark before, and I can tell you it definitely was not a fun situation, especially when it came to figuring out where we're parking the boat, setting up camp, all of those things. So just always give yourself as much time as possible if you can. Next thing, once you actually get to where you're going, this kind of feeds off into what I was just talking about, but in the Bahamas, make sure you're going in, you're clearing customs and immigration. And when you do this, make sure you ask any questions based on things that you're unfamiliar with. Understand that fishing and boating regulations may be different over in the Bahamas, or say, for example, in an area like the dry Tortugas. You know, in the Bahamas, no wake zones aren't necessarily marked correctly. Channels aren't always marked correctly. So it's best to just ask those questions and familiarize yourself with the area based on fishing, boating, whatever it may be, because it's very easy to break rules when you're just in an unfamiliar area, when so much of your time and your energy is just focused on navigating, because you want to make sure you don't mess up, right? For example, the dry Tortugas, there's little things that most people would never even know. Like, majority of the area around the fort, you're not allowed to anchor your boat. So, you know, that's something to keep in mind. There's designated anchoring areas in those places. So you want to make sure that you're not breaking any rules in that aspect. Some other little things, they're very strict about lights in the dry Tortugas. They don't want super bright lights. It's illegal to actually have underwater lights on in the dry Tortugas. So just make sure once you get there, ask a couple questions. In the dry Tortugas, information isn't necessarily as accessible because people aren't necessarily always around to answer those questions. So just dive deep, do a little research, and just figure out where you can fish, where you can't fish, what your regulations are, where you can anchor, where you can't anchor, because these things can be very important. And the rules for a reason, and that's to protect places like the Bahamas and places like the dry Tortugas. And ultimately, you should always have this mentality, even when you're at home. Educate yourself with the area, ask questions, and don't always act like you know everything, because even till this day, somebody that does it a lot like myself, I'm constantly always asking questions to familiarize myself, make sure we're not breaking any rules. Anyway, once you get there, have fun, enjoy it, relax. But of course, as you're over there, you're having a good time. Something that I'm always doing is I'm continuing to monitor the weather from the moment I get there, from the moment that I decide to leave. The reason why is because, say for example, you leave on Friday, you're coming home on a Monday, there's very high potential that the forecast can change Saturday, Sunday night, and say for example, you wake up Monday morning and out of nowhere, there's just storms, winds have increased, and you're stuck in the Bahamas. So Make sure that you're constantly checking the weather, because in some cases you may have to leave a couple days early or a day early, or maybe even stay there for a couple days for the safety of you and your family. So always anticipate these things, always continue to check the weather. Now, a huge downside to visiting a place like the Dry Tortugas is you don't have service once you're there. So right before I leave, I like screenshotting the conditions for the next couple days all the way up until the day that I leave, because I know once I get there, I won't know what the forecast is going to be. So I like to have some type of idea. So continue to monitor the weather. Another thing too, don't get cocky, stick to the buddy system, because what I like doing, especially when I'm in the Bahamas, is I like exploring. I like getting away from the mainland. Same thing in the Dry Tortugas. I like finding new areas. And you know, once you start exploring and venturing out, remember, you don't have service. You don't have a way of getting towed back. So sticking to that buddy system, going everywhere with the person or the buddy boat that you came with is highly recommended, because if you do have a problem, you want to make sure that you guys are there to help each other out all along the way. Once you get home and you're sticking to that buddy system, all the same rules apply. You know, make sure you have your fuel before you leave, heading back home. Make sure that the seas are favorable. Everything is exactly the same way as it is coming home as it was getting over to the Bahamas or a place like the Dry Tortugas. Say, for example, you're coming back from the Bahamas, you have to clear back into the United States. And there's actually an app that I use. It's called CBP Roam. And basically you're gonna put in all the information based on your boat, all of your passengers, you're gonna submit that into US Customs, and then basically you're gonna wait on an approval based on the United States letting you back into the country. There shouldn't be any issues, I would imagine. Sometimes they require you to do a FaceTime call, so make sure once you submit that, everybody that came over with you on the boat is still in your presence, because the officer may say, hey, Clay, I want to see your face. I want to see this passenger's face and that passenger's face. Regardless if you're in a small boat or you're in a big boat, you know, this is very helpful for anybody that wants to make any type of long range crossing over to the Bahamas, or say somewhere where you don't necessarily have the help. With that being said, if there's anything that I left out in this video, it would be greatly appreciated if you guys included it in the comment thread below. But yeah, hopefully this helps. Hopefully you guys can make a trip here, you know, in the spring of 2024, or maybe you're seeing this later on down the road, closer to summertime. But ultimately, we hope you guys enjoyed it. We hope you got tons of value, and we hope that the video gave you the confidence that you need in order to make this trip.